Good evening again. This is Harry Frank with the Vermont School Boards Association. I want to welcome you to tonight's webinar, Self-Assessment, Goal Setting, and the Board Annual Work Calendar. As a general welcome to the School Boards Association's programming, I want to briefly tell you about the association. We are a membership organization. All the public school boards in Vermont are members of the Vermont School Boards Association, and we provide training and support through programs such as this evening's webinar, as well as a collective voice at the public policy table, frequently in the legislature. Tonight we are going to do some background work through statements from our self-assessment survey tool to identify goals that are appropriate for board work and translate those into the board work calendar. Essentially, I'm trying to walk you through what I refer to as a cycle of good governance, which includes that act of looking back and assessing progress on a vision, identifying priorities or goals for the work to come, and documenting that in a calendar form, which can serve to be an effective mechanism for boards to follow up on their work going forward. Let me walk you through how tonight's webinar will work. The presentation will be by way of PowerPoint slides, and I'll invite your participation at multiple points by asking you to respond in the question box, which is one of the options on your control panel, which should appear to the right of your screen when you join the webinar. There will be an evaluation at the end, which is helpful for our purposes, so I hope you will take a moment to respond to the half-dozen questions that we have for you following tonight's webinar. And then we will follow up with each of you in an email which will include tonight's slides, supporting materials, and as you see, links to the video and answers to any questions that we don't address during the actual session. So a brief introduction of myself. Again, my name is Harry Frank. I serve as the Director of Education Services at the School Boards Association, and I'm joined this evening by Kerri Lamb. Kerri, are you there, and would you briefly introduce yourself, please?
I am here. Kerri Lamb. I'm the Director of Operations for VSBA, and I will be here reading your questions that come in.
So Kerri will assist me, as she said, by reading questions and keeping me apprised of comments, threads that I ought to weave into the presentation, and those will also be in the follow-up document that we send you. So again, and with a little more detail, the way we'll work tonight is to I've selected a number of statements from our self-assessment survey. That's a resource that's available to you through our website. You can find it on the resource tab under the essential work of Vermont School Boards. Again, this information will be in our follow-up. That will prompt some exchange about goals that speak to those areas of the board's work, and I'll translate that into a calendar of the board's work over a 12-month cycle. So we'll actually build a sample work calendar over the next hour. As I mentioned, it's this notion of a cycle of good governance, looking back at what's been accomplished and needs to be addressed, identifying tasks specific or goals in those areas, and then laying out a more specific timeline to attend to those tasks. Before we do jump into those details, I want to take a half step back and think broadly about what the role of the board is, and then move forward. We use this term trustee to imply how important the relationship is between the board and the community, because fundamentally the community puts its trust in the board to deliver on three critical outcomes: a high-quality education for every student in the system, a good return on investment for the public, and that's certainly measured in terms of dollars, but much more is at stake here, obviously, in the faith that our citizens put in our schools to educate their children and in many respects build strong communities. And to operate efficiently, effectively, and ethically to reinforce that trust that communities invest in us, in our boards. I also want to draw a line and return to it at different times tonight to remind the board that the term oversight is the idea that you set expectations, provide guidance, and direct the administration in the person of the superintendent to fulfill those expectations. It's an important distinction to understand, and we'll attend to that as we go through tonight's session. So, high quality education for every student, good return on investment, efficient, effective, and ethical operation of the school system. One more step before proceeding through the essential components of the board's work is a reminder that many school boards in Vermont are members of a supervisory union, which essentially expands the scope of the board's responsibilities. In the same way, it's critical for the board to attend to the education of every student and the operations of that system to serve in the most effective and efficient way. All of this work really is built around a common vision, a set of goals and priorities, and is facilitated by an effective board team. As I mentioned a few times, the essential work of school boards is the structure that we've established to describe the responsibilities of the school board in greater detail. This is the same format in which our publication is organized, and I referenced our website, so I certainly encourage you to go there to get further information in each of these areas. We'll spend more time in each of these 7 areas. So I will say just briefly, the cycle in our minds does not flow precisely in this way, but there's a very clear set of connections here. That idea of serving as trustees and engaging the community enables this organization to have a vision for where it's going. That vision is what a superintendent is employed to fulfill, to lead in achieving. And the board provides parameters by establishing policies, drawing essentially the outline within which the system and the superintendent more specifically operates. The board's also obligated to adopt a budget. Again, you'll see that we frequently reference the vision in this overview to reinforce how important it is that that's what drives all of the board's work. And again, monitoring progress. So if you're going to set out to accomplish something, it's critical that you attend to measuring your progress and using that information to continually improve your work. Negotiating is one of the other statutory responsibilities of the board, and we see it as more and more important in the board's work, important in the sense of it being aligned with that vision, student needs, community expectations. All right, one more note about the annual school board self-assessment survey. Again, the tool that is available on our website and will serve as the backbone of tonight's presentation. These survey statements are aligned with the essential work that I just briefly narrated as I walked around that cycle. I will use select statements from the survey to focus our conversation really my presentation, and looking for your comment in each of those essential areas. The way that survey is formatted, each statement is followed by a set of 4 options: agree strongly, disagree, and disagree strongly. And that, again, is a way for a board to take stock of how it's doing with respect to different components of its work. As we move through those sections, I invite you to respond based on where your board is currently and where you see it needing to go in its work going forward. And finally, this is the template we'll populate this evening. As I or maybe didn't mention this, we'll also make this available for your use following the session. It will be attached to the follow-up materials. You'll notice in this framework that the elements of the essential work are now listed along the left-hand column. So we'll be filling in examples of the work that correspond to each of those components of essential work. Recognizing that this is a simplified snapshot of an annual work calendar that really pulls out and highlights certain high-profile tasks. It's not intended to be an exhaustive example, and it really assumes that much of the work here is ongoing work, and so again we're pulling out certain components to highlight particular tasks. All right, so let's dive in more deeply to each of the elements of the essential work, beginning with engage the community. I did touch on this term trustee. I want to revisit that by saying how important it is for the board to be actively engaged with the community, essentially effective advocates for your students. While you need the community's assent to move forward, it's critical that they're well informed of what your aspirations are as a school system. So there's a responsibility for the board to educate the community as to the purposes of your system and particular initiatives that may take shape in a given year. So let's use this statement from the board self-evaluation survey to focus the discussion a little further. I'm going to read this and pause briefly. Again, invite and encourage you to comment by writing into the question box that Kerri is going to help me navigate. So take a moment to read through this, and as I suggested, if you have a comment or question for that matter, to go ahead and type that in. Again, as you can, excuse me, as you consider this prompt, take stock of what the board is currently doing and ways in which it can extend its current work, or if it is a new area of work, identify it as such. Again, you can do this for yourself in your own notes, and I will continue to move forward with examples and look for ways to incorporate comments and questions that come in. So let me just pause briefly, and then I'll move on to my example. Okay, for those of you that may not be aware, I'm going to do a brief half step back to explain the work around what are now called proficiency-based graduation requirements. And you'll see those now in your sample board annual work calendar template highlighted in the months of June and September. Proficiency-based graduation requirements are a description of the skills and aptitudes and knowledge base or content base that the state is committed to ensuring every student achieves the ability to perform, essentially. So proficiencies are the notion that that there are a set of skills and aptitudes and subject matter that every student should be able to work with effectively. Let me draw the contrast with what historically has been our expectation for high school graduation, actually our requirements for high school graduation, which have been measured in terms of credits accumulated through the system called Carnegie Units, which essentially assigns it for a class in high school. The challenge that the new education quality standards are attempting to address is the concern that a student could proceed through high school and receive a low grade of C-D in English, for example, for 4 years and still accumulate those credits enough to graduate. Now we're saying there are certain skills like the ability to read critically and articulate ideas in speech and writing that are proficiency-based rather than credit-based. All right, so in June and September, the opportunity when high school seniors are graduating to highlight, essentially provide evidence of how student learning has taken shape for our graduates is a natural connection. Could be something that the board highlights through different means of communication, but there is certainly a moment there in the school calendar when that's much of the focus. In a similar fashion, when the school year begins in September, or late August for that matter, there's really opportunity again to inform, engage the community around our expectations for high school graduation, and in presenting information about what are those proficiencies, many of which are driven by state rule at this point, but there is also room for boards to include local expectations. There's this great opportunity to message what are those expectations and how does that reflect what we believe all our students should achieve and have as a capacity going forward. So those two times are places where the board could focus an effort around messaging those expectations and evidence of performance around proficiencies. Moving on to visioning, or this idea of creating a vision, it may well be that systems, and many of ours do, have very well established and refined visions that have evolved over time and continue to evolve. It's critical that the board work be focused on achieving that vision. If you know where you want to go, you can design ways to get there, and the board can be effective in articulating that and monitoring progress toward those ends. So one of the questions, or two of the questions I frequently ask boards when I work with them really on everything from initial orientations to future planning sessions is to really draw out from people what's most important for your students to know and be able to do. And while in the first segment I talked about proficiencies, I also mentioned the idea of local expectations or graduation requirements that boards have a part in defining. I think board members come to their work with certain convictions and aspirations for their students, and I think it's critical to engage in that conversation. At the same time, I think it's critical for the board to step back and say, well, what's our role in accomplishing these ends? It's really a conversation among board members and community members, and among board members, community members, and the educational staff of the school system. The superintendent is really the sort of leverage point in those relationships as he or she serves as the leader and manager of the school system. So that set of exchanges is what is in the background of the vision statement for a school system. Let's move to the statement then. So in parallel fashion to engaging the community, we'll do this with each of the other areas of the essential work. So with respect to creating a vision, the statement I'd like you to think about, and I will then move us through an example of, is thinking about the board's work in terms of the vision is focused on what we want for our children, is written in terms of expected results for student learning, rather than activities the district will engage in. So let me give you a moment to consider this.
Kerri?
Yes.
Susan Harrington has a question or statement that regarding vision. She said she'd love to have another session on defining vision, how to prevent a small vocal part of the community from dominating community engagement. how to set up engagement strategies that truly include a broad presentation of the community, and how to reconcile competing views of interest.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and I think it's one of the challenges boards face frequently, is how to engage the broadest representation of the community in much of this work, and certainly visioning is probably the key and critical point. There are certainly multiple strategies for doing so. I'll just comment briefly on those and then suggest that, well, the section of our publication on the essential work of school boards will touch on a few of my comments here and provide some other resources, including formats and scripts for orchestrating different kinds of community conversations. So I guess I'm trying to acknowledge the challenge, identify some of the resources here, and underscore how important it is for boards to attend to this work around vision and recognize the concerns that that the participant just brought up. Thanks, Kerri, for responding there, or for interrupting there. You know, a couple of quick examples. I think the Burlington and Winooski school districts' efforts to engage a broad base are a great example of outreach that included broad, you know, large group forums as well as small group conversations that, as I understand, actually took place in people's living rooms. So there's a great example there. There also are examples where school districts, and I'll reference Orange Southwest, which is the Randolph area, on an annual basis brings members of the community into the school to be part of a reading program and send students out into the community as a way of engaging them in a particular activity that is a component of the vision for that system. The ability to use those academic skills in community settings and experiences, and it gives both students and citizens a firsthand opportunity to engage with each other around a very discrete piece of the vision, but certainly a meaningful one. So there certainly are many other examples, and again, I would encourage people to turn to the Essential Workbook for some additional resources there. So to come back to the frame I want to walk us through here, the example I wanted to provide is the idea of soon after the new board is seated in the spring, so that's why you see it in April, engaging both the board in those conversations that give individual board members an opportunity to articulate their convictions and passions and aspirations for students, and using that opportunity to really help board members get to know each other, get to understand perspectives that people bring, obviously with an eye toward alignment, as in the board coming to you know, a common understanding of what their purposes are, what their vision for the school system is, and in some fashion, and it's not always an annual event, but we certainly suggest it's a best practice for the board to find avenues to draw the community into those conversations. And again, I tried to give two examples. One was a very broad-based one in Burlington and Winooski, where the conversations were really those ultimate ends kinds of conversations. What do we want our high school graduates to know and be able to do? And at the other end of the spectrum in Orange Orange Southwest, an example where, a very discrete component of the school's program focus on reading opens the door to an opportunity to engage the community, often in a one-on-one dynamic, but certainly in small groups, to give people a first-hand experience with what's happening in the school system and see ways in which that vision, that aspiration for students is coming to life. All right. Moving on to the work of the superintendent and really the relationship between the board and the superintendent. The working relationship between the board and the superintendent is really central to the organization's ability to fulfill the mission. We often say that hiring the superintendent is probably the most important decision the board will make, because it's that individual who as I said, leads in the broadest sense and manages in the day-to-day sense the life of this organization. That said, I think there's a corresponding responsibility that the board carries to attract, grow and retain leaders who are a good fit for their system. And so implied in that all those components of an effective working relationship is how important it is. We define it further by using a term, mutual accountability. The idea that the board is accountable for articulating and documenting its expectations clearly. The vision statement is an example of expectations. We'll touch on more specific examples of that. And the superintendent is expected to provide evidence to the board of progress in meeting those expectations, the broadest in terms of vision, the most specific in terms of things like financial management. We'll talk more about that as well. But I also want to underscore or say again how important that sense of a common mission or common vision and mission is, and that the kind of trusting relationship that boards and superintendents need to invest in will really be the basis for both board and superintendent to fulfill their duties effectively. How do we focus this? This statement, again, taken from our annual self-assessment survey, points importantly at an annual evaluation. Really in the spirit of continuous improvement, the idea is that the board fulfills that responsibility of articulating, documenting its expectations, and has a mechanism for collecting evidence from the superintendent on progress or plans to make progress if initial plans aren't successful. What does that look like then in terms of the annual work calendar? So under the superintendent category, I've highlighted superintendent evaluation and listed it both in October and November and January and February. So October and November are really the points at which the evaluation process is a question of readiness. What's in place to facilitate an effective evaluation? Is there a current job description for the superintendent? Does the superintendent have a set of goals and even a work plan that's specific to his or her goals? That's all foundational material that the board should have developed or be in partnership with the superintendent to develop, or have, be presented by the superintendent so that it's clear to them, it's clear to the superintendent and the board what the expectations are for performance. The other time frame that's highlighted here is January and February. That's typically in place because superintendent contracts typically are renewed in the spring, as are most of the other contracts in the school system. And so it's a way of drawing clearly the time frame that says, you know, this process needs to be complete so that we can make informed decisions going into the new contracting cycle. Budgeting. You'll notice that there are two sides of coin here. I hope you can appreciate my use of the money metaphor here in the context of budgeting work, budgeting and financial management work. Those really are the two sides, right? Budgeting, planning for the use of your resources so as to best fulfill the vision you have, and on the flip side, making sure that you have mechanisms in place to assure that those resources, dollars and otherwise, are being used appropriately. In fact, it's critical to ensure that the financial house is in order to really enable an emphasis on students' teaching and learning. So it's that kind of stewardship of the financial resources that enables the big picture work to proceed. A couple of other notes before moving on to a specific prompt here. Budget development and management is year-round work. I mentioned as at the outset here that while I'm highlighting certain components of the board's work, much of this work is ongoing. So budgeting and managing the finances, or overseeing the management of the finances, I should say more carefully, is year-round work. The board is responsible for going first and last. First in the sense of describing what that vision is and what priorities there are within that vision, because in a given year there may in fact be certain items that are the highest priorities. In addition, the board needs to be clear about what are the parameters. Are there any limitations, or maybe more positively, what is the capacity in the community to support the work we want to do? In all communities, there's a limit to that capacity. So what's most important to the board and what does the board understand to be the capacity in the community to support that? With those parameters in place, it's really the work of the administrators to be creative in developing a budget to achieve the vision, given those boundaries, those parameters. It's also, as I mentioned in the context of evaluating the superintendent, appropriate for the board to expect evidence from the administrative team, the leadership team, to support the proposals in the budget, essentially providing evidence for the past use of resources and making the case for how to allocate those resources going forward. So I've sort of preempted myself here a little bit. The statement taken from the self-assessment survey, and I've actually got two to capture both sides of this coin, are that the board develops broad budget parameters and understands that it's the administration's responsibility to create the line item details. And then on the flip side, that the board assures that internal controls are in place to protect public funds. Essentially internal controls being mechanisms to assess and evaluate the expenditure of dollars to determine that they're being used consistently with what they were intended for. Not sure I paused on the evaluation one, so let me pause here briefly. And again, as Kerri notices comments and questions, I had asked her to interrupt me or chime in with suggestions as we go, but let me pause for a moment.
I don't see any right now, Harry.
Okay. So what you'll see highlighted here under budgeting is in the month of May, financial policies, internal controls, and a reporting timeline. Again, it's intended to come soon after the new board is seated because it serves in some respects as a component of new board members' orientation. I think it also provides a helpful reminder to experienced board members of what your current practices are, again, with respect to policies, controls, and reporting. So that's identified in the month of May. And then in the months of September and October are the term budget parameters, which I had described earlier as both the broad aspirational guidelines that would be articulated in the vision and possibly defined even further by prioritizing elements of the vision, certain goals for a one-year period, as well as information about what the board feels is the capacity of the community to support budget increases. So those are two components, or the two sides of that budgeting and financial management coin. Policies. Let me begin by reading a brief quotation that we've borrowed from the National School Board Association that describes in broad terms what the nature of, or nature and character of, school board policy is. So I'm quoting here: when we speak about school board policy, we speak about ideas with the power to set directions for the school system, to bring about prudent action by the administration, the staff, and the board itself. A soundly constructed policy will tell the administration enough so that it can get working on the task in accordance with the board's wishes. Really, policy enables the board to be clear on what it wants accomplished. It sets parameters and defines areas where you don't want the school system going. Those policies, much like Vision, which is a policy document, are based on values of the community and best practices from the professional educators. They really are assurance that you're managing risk appropriately and meeting all the legal obligations of the school district, and provide a clear boundary that allows the superintendent and the educational staff to do their work without the board getting involved in the micromanagement of the organization. So policy provides that boundary. It is critical for a school board, a district supervisory union, to keep their policies updated, and we provide support services as well as a model policy manual, also resources that are available on our website. And that work is typically delegated to a subcommittee of the board. All that said, having policies, knowing your policies, really doesn't matter if you don't follow the policies. And so the sort of boundary or the line I'm trying to reinforce here is how important it is for a board certainly to be thoughtful and considered in developing policies and documenting them, but once they're in place, holding ourselves to those boundaries. I often reflect on the fact that policies are documents that have evolved over generations and represent really the collective wisdom of the organization. And while policies are continually updated and refined, they are an essential foundation for the work that boards are attempting to accomplish. So what's the particular statement to look at in this context? The board has developed an ongoing system to review and update all policies every 3 to 5 years. As I mentioned, that's typically work of a subcommittee that meets on a regular basis every month or every other month. That said, I think it's important for all board members to know what's your current practice. How does the system make sure that policies are reviewed and updated as a both orientation, part of an orientation to the board's work, and again, a reminder to upholding that obligation. That said, I wanted to pull out a couple of specific examples to highlight the importance of attending to these policies. So beginning in March, you see on the policy line board operations policies. I'll say a little bit more later on about the annual reorganization meeting. Essentially, it's the time and place where the board revisits its expectations for its own work and fulfills some of the other statutory obligations to identify meeting place and time, places where information will be posted, etc. So board policies in March, you'll see again policy in July and August. Those are in place ahead of the beginning of the school year to make sure that both required policies that have been passed down from the legislature and signed into law are attended to, policy manuals are updated in time for the beginning of the school year, and student policies, which obviously come to bear most notably during the school year, but probably are most attended to at the beginning of the school year. So a couple of examples to highlight important pieces of policy work while not overshadowing the fact that policy work, again, like much of what is on this calendar, recognizing that it's that these are ongoing tasks. Monitoring progress toward the vision, assuring accountability for results. In many respects, we've been talking about monitoring throughout. In fact, those items I've highlighted on the calendar are really monitoring activities. So I wanted to just use this as a reminder to step back and say how important monitoring is in the work of the board, and then talk a little bit more specifically about how critical it is to look at student learning, to monitor student learning over time. A quick note, while in the past we have largely used standardized test scores, other measures like attendance, dropout rates, graduation rates, and college entrance or higher education employment rates to assess our system's performance at the high school graduation level and other junctures along the way. There have been and continue to be important local assessments that are part of describing that picture effectively, monitoring that progress toward the vision. And going forward, the education quality reviews, these are directly related to the education quality standards I mentioned early on, will provide a set of data points that are consistent across the state for looking at student achievement, the climate of our schools, the financial practices of our systems. So there are good resources in the development process. So let's attend then more specifically to this component of the monitoring responsibility, evaluating progress toward goals specific to student learning and goals specific to systems operations. What you'll see then in the calendar on the monitoring line is a highlight of around student learning that's identified at 4 points during the year, beginning in March, again in June, September, and December. There are obviously a wide range of areas that a board can look at in the context of student learning. I've highlighted it in the most general way here to underscore how important it is to uphold that practice as a way of focusing really on what the vision speaks to, which is what we want our students to know and be able to do going forward. The other component of the monitoring responsibilities that I highlighted here in August is the annual audit. Again, a statutory responsibility of the board to conduct an external audit that ideally is available to the board prior to the start of the next budgeting cycle. Typically begins in September or certainly by October. And so that component of the board's work is particularly important in fulfilling those monitoring responsibilities. A quick comment about the audit. I think we recognize how much of a sort of foreign thing financial audit is for many board members, how important it is to engage with that audit in a meaningful way. And so some of the material included in the Essential Work of School Boards guide that I've mentioned a couple times tries to provide very specific almost sort of conversational scripts for board members to employ in hearing from the auditor, asking good questions, connecting the annual audit to the regular financial management reports that the board sees over the course of the year. Operating effectively, ethically, and for that matter legally, this final section of the essential work covers a range of responsibilities that really are truly ongoing. That said, they are important steps that the boards can take to increase its capacity to fulfill its responsibilities. And truthfully, attention to these responsibilities affects the credibility of the board, and frankly, not just your own board, but really all of our school boards. So this is really about the character and practice of an effective board, and for that matter, of effective individual board member behavior. Couple items drawn from state law. It's critical to avoid conflict of interest and, for that matter, the perception of a conflict of interest. That's typically included in the board's code of ethics, which we feel is an important practice for boards to attend to on an annual basis, discussing and signing a code of ethics, and upholding open meeting law. Again, a statutory obligation of school boards, and in that context employing executive session appropriately and fulfilling the responsibilities to provide public records. Really, in the end, the message around this area of responsibility is to recognize that boards have obligations to meet in public, that their power comes from that publicly convened meeting, that individual board members do not have power in the sense that the board does. And so by disciplining by individual board members, upholding that discipline of conducting their work as transparently, ethically, and efficiently as possible, we can reinforce both that trusting relationship between the board and the community, and between the board and the superintendent, and through him or her, the entire school system. It's really about assuring that schools are well run, but not trying to actually run them. It's the recognition that the board has a very specific role to play here. The statement I took from this section of the self-assessment survey speaks specifically to the Code of Ethics. Again, this is a document available on our website. It's a component piece of the essential work of school boards. And so what I did was go ahead and put it in the, it's really listed in the policy bubble there in March when I referenced board operations policies. And then more specifically, I added the reorganization meeting. As I mentioned earlier, that's the first meeting of the new board when there are a set of tasks that the board needs to attend to. Our strongest recommendation is that the code of ethics is included in that set of tasks at the reorganization meeting. That's also a resource available on our website. We have a separate section which addresses the reorganization meeting and includes checklists of all the tasks that a board needs to attend to during that session. Finally, I want to touch on the responsibility of negotiating contracts, again by emphasizing aligning that work with the vision, what you want for your students, what your students need, and what the community expects of this organization. More specifically, the statement from our self-assessment survey speaks to the board handling collective bargaining responsibilities effectively, seeking to find the proper balance between assuring a highly qualified and motivated workforce and recognizing the local taxpayer ability to pay. I'm pausing briefly for people if they would like to chime in by way of the question box, and then I'll move us on to the details that I've illustrated in the calendar.
I don't see any questions at this time, Harry.
Okay, thanks, Kerri. All right, so what you see here then on the negotiations line beginning in April is the responsibility of the board to identify a timeline for the negotiating process, as well as be clear about what the goals are from the board, and to inform the community, sort of develop and fulfill the first steps of a communications plan, so as to let people know what is that timeline and what are those intended outcomes or goals that the board has established. You'll see again negotiations highlighted in October when typically the negotiation process starts. That work is carried typically by a subcommittee of the board, and there are resources that boards turn to, including superintendents and district attorneys who work for the school district to support the board in that work. So those are the particular elements of negotiations. Again, as with all of these categories, recognizing that much of this work happens on a 12-month basis. I've used these examples to highlight particular tasks in the 12-month calendar of the board's work. So in closing, I wanted to revisit briefly our vision, which is articulated here. Fundamentally, we see ourselves as serving as effective trustees as well. So that's a little bit more about the VSBA, and in the follow-up materials you'll receive this slide with contact information. Finally, there are some important upcoming events in the VSBA calendar that I wanted to highlight here, and while we don't have specific dates and locations yet for our regional meetings, you should know that those will occur in the months of September and October, and then we'll convene our statewide conference on October 20th and 21st. So thank you for attending tonight's webinar, and please again take a minute to complete the online evaluation that comes up as you exit the webinar. Thank you.